Separate, when they're reflecting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a bit unusual brightness that device. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today here at the SME for Labour Fringe. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm CEO of OpenUK. I spent 25 years as a lawyer across the tech sector from whenever it was, working internationally from 2000 and in open source from 2008. And for the last 5-6 years, I've led an industry body in the UK called OpenUK. We are about the business of open technology, which is open source software, hardware, data, standards, and AI openness. And we're very much born of sovereignty, our topic for the conversation today. We're born of sovereignty because we realised on Brexit that the UK needed its own industry body, but previously we'd been part of the European EU one. So we started to look at sovereignty as an organisation 5 years ago, and it was particularly relevant to us because open source has become something of a phenomenon in recent years, but largely through global collaboration. And our purpose is UK leadership. You want to move that? Okay, more? Okay, so our purpose is UK leadership and global collaboration in open technology. Because really, open source has become a phenomenon, particularly in the last 10-15 years in the enterprise space, because of that global cross-border collaboration. And what we see today is an environment where when you look at a cloud environment, when you look at a commercial stack, something like 90% of the software that's sitting underneath that has dependencies, which means it needs the open source to run on open source software. Over 70% of software today is open source in those stacks, probably around 76%. And open source is really important to the UK because we are Europe's leader. We have more contributors to open source projects than any country in Europe. In the world, we're about 4th, 5th. And then when we look at lines of code contributed, we stay as number 1. Even in the AI space, we rank as number 1 in AI openness. Although what we also see is President Macron driving policies and initiatives, I would say, in France that are really making France the fastest growing in open source today. So it's a bit of a wake-up call for us. When we look at the way we measure those software engineers, we look at GitHub accounts. It's not perfect, but it's the way everybody in the world measures it. And not only are we number 1 in Europe, but we have 6.1% of the UK's population which has a GitHub account. Now that is a huge percentage. It is more than any country in the world per capita. So one of the ways the UK distinguishes itself is this open source leadership. And that leadership very much comes from collaboration. And that software today, as I say, is so important because it sits under our digital infrastructure. And our digital infrastructure is critical to us all because over the last few years, even the most reluctant parts of the public sector, the most reluctant enterprises have become digitized. And that digitization means that they are dependent on infrastructure that today is built on AI and software, and which is very much defined by open source. So when we talk about sovereignty, we have this really difficult challenge that's very relevant to open source, which is why we pulled this conversation together today. But it's also very relevant to the future of the UK and to the services that both enterprises and UK government deliver to its citizens. And it's very relevant because we see a world where our services are delivered digitally. Brexit isn't the only geopolitical shift of recent years. We've seen geopolitics and concerns around sovereignty escalate up the political agenda and the technology agenda this year, partly with the change in administration, and partly with the realization, one that's been happening actually for several years, that in some countries there is a huge dependency on technology from other countries. How you want to take that forward really depends on your views on sovereignty and what you mean by sovereignty. And we often see debates and conversations about sovereignty with people talking at cross purposes. It can be something that's very exclusionary or something that's very inclusionary. So a few months ago, realizing that this was one of the digital topics of 2025, we worked with SME for Labour to pull together this panel. And at the time, we brought together speakers, Karl Havard, who is from Nscale, NVIDIA's Beverton-Palmer, and Yemm MP. So when you look at these speakers, you may think that we did this 2 weeks ago because there's been a lot of press stories around the companies that you were seeing here today, but actually this was organised months ago, and I personally had no insider knowledge of what was going on, so it was sort of a happy coincidence that we have two companies that are really at the heart of what's happening in AI and infrastructure in our digital environments today. So we're going to speak to those panelists, allow them to talk to us about what sovereignty is, about what sovereignty brings to us, how we best benefit from sovereignty here in the UK, or resilience, or whether we actually, sovereignty and resilience are the same thing. We've got a bit of a discussion and debate around that across the panel. We have Karl Havard, who is a commercially seasoned individual in the hyperscale space, having worked for AWS and Google before Nscale. We have Beverton-Palmer, who's head of policy in the UK in NVIDIA and has worked for about 15 years, I believe, in policy, including for Sky, for Ofcom, and at the Tony Blair Institute. And Yemm MP from Mansfield, who possibly isn't the most technical of the four of us today, but has a technical background and is to be commended as an MP for coming and joining us today and taking on this difficult conversation. So I'm going to run this so that we have at least half an hour of discussion with our panel. We'll then move to audience questions and have to wrap up with a hard stop at 3:55. So coming first to the panel, I want to ask all of you really, when we talk about sovereignty and the different approaches, we see things ranging from very inclusive approaches to not created here. In a number of countries, including France and India, we're seeing AI being built from the ground up, and then we're seeing different environments where localization is what's happening. So I'm going to ask the panel how they characterize sovereignty and how they see resilience, and for the UK, how does that fit? Who'd like to jump in first?
I'll go. Thanks, Amanda. NVIDIA is the kind of AI infrastructure company that you've probably heard of now for the last 2 weeks of announcements that we've had in the UK around the state visit last week, where we announced £11 billion investment in UK infrastructure alongside £2 billion startup investment as well. And so for NVIDIA, we build AI infrastructure around the world. We build the hardware and the software that sits in that hardware that enables people to use what we call accelerated computing. So in the old world, that meant accelerated computing for video games graphics, so you could create 3D images using computing power that you never could before. And then the world since 2013, it means AI and machine learning and neural networks. So what does that mean for the UK and NVIDIA's eyes? Well, the UK has some of the world's best researchers, has some of the world's best companies as well, that are producing amazing applications in AI, new research and development, associated with some of the world's best universities. So sovereignty for us means creating the infrastructure and the platforms for people to do the kind of best work in the country where they found, and to keep that work in the country, so it creates what we can call this sovereign AI flywheel. Essentially, kind of providing the infrastructure, providing the tools for people to accelerate their work, or in AI speak, kind of their AI workloads, that allows them to create further investments in jobs, in further infrastructure, in skills and research and talent development, which spins what we call this sovereign AI flywheel that leads to more great companies, more research, and a strong AI ecosystem in the country. We, the government, in January of this year, seems like a long time ago, produced the AI Opportunities Action Plan, which I think was a kind of a great example of the country setting out its ambitions to be at the forefront of AI development. And having spent a lot of time in the last few weeks with American colleagues coming over here who don't stereotype Americans, but they're much more positive than Brits. And they basically came over and said, like, Britain has incredible resources in terms of research, development skills, universities, and companies as well. and sometimes we get slightly obsessed with this idea. We can't compete on a global stage in technology, whereas we're right up there. So NVIDIA wants to play its part in making the UK and helping the government achieve its mission, the UK to be an AI maker.
So when you talk about that, can you explain a little bit more about how that's sovereign?
How that's sovereign?
Yeah.
So it's about building, using the capabilities of the country. So
Yeah.
the sovereign stuff in the country. And what do I mean by that? It means kind of building infrastructure on UK soil. It means UK researchers and UK talent, UK skills development that turns further investment in those core elements of what I talked about. So you can cut, like, without getting too much into the kind of the intellectual debate about like the definition of sovereignty, which you can cut in like many different ways. For us, it means allowing companies and researchers, and what we would call as a company, AI developers, to create value in that company that creates more value, and value can be both economic value and it can also be social value in terms of research and development.
So a sort of almost a form of enablement of in-country expertise, skills, business building through that sharing technology. Karl?
Yeah, I can add some more. So I think just over 20 years ago, the UK and Europe, can you hear me okay? Were pretty slow. And what I mean by that is we were reliant upon US tech companies emerging, particularly on the West Coast, to provide their cloud service provision. Because they were a search engine, was a software company, it was a retailer, and they had spare capacity, and they decided to Airbnb their spare compute for the rest of the world. And the rest of the world over 20 years has then jumped on that behavioural law, which now across government, across UK enterprises, if you want to spin up anything associated to IT, the easiest way is go to your drop-down menu, fire up an instance, and away it goes, and you just get your bill increase at the end of the month. And that is some data centre firing away in the US typically. So with the emergence of AI, what Max says about the AI flywheel for the UK, the NVIDIA equipment is a slightly different style of compute than's typically been needed. It requires a lot more power, it's very high density, it requires a different style of cooling, and therefore legacy data centres from traditional clouds are no longer fit for purpose. So it's level set globally the whole landscape of what we need to do to house AI, which gave the UK and non-US companies an opportunity in the last 2 years. So if we have the ability now to maybe not sit back and just continue to rely upon the US hyperscalers, but actually we can take our own level of control and build something ourselves, then wouldn't that be great? Because when we then talked about UK sovereignty, we're talking about a number of things. We become self-sufficient. So that means we don't necessarily rely upon the laws of the US. So the Cloud First Act, or the Patriot Act, won't be called upon UK enterprises or UK startups.
Because it's on sovereign soil.
That's right, and being served by a UK domiciled organisation within the laws of the land. There was the criminal commission in Hague, the CEO of that. He had his Microsoft access cut off because the president of the US didn't want him to access that particular morning of what he was going to access, and that was the calling of the Sovereign Act. So it's real. So if we have the ability from a UK domiciled organisation to serve UK startups, UK enterprises, and UK government from a UK domiciled platform, then that means we have that level of control amongst ourselves. And our aim is to get the flywheel and invest in the infrastructure economy. The other thing, which I think is absolutely key and sometimes gets missed on sovereignty, if it's served from a UK domiciled consortium, so it's UK energy, UK data centres, we acquire US technology, we repatronise it as you would do a Harley Davidson motorcycle, which I tend to ride occasionally. It's mine, it's not the US's. We put it into the UK, we then serve it through a UK service, and then to your point about software tools on top, we stimulate the UK startup community around that. We have then a pretty strong UK sovereign consortium which boosts the economy directly to the that money doesn't come in and then go to the shores of another land. It stays within the UK, and that's why we are attracting overseas investment to build out the infrastructure to make sure we can use AI as a way to boost the economy.
So if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that we are looking at a form of sovereignty here where what we have isn't isolationist, it's in collaboration with others, bringing globally leading innovation into the UK, enabling us not only to use that innovation in the short term, but also to build an ecosystem around the innovation we use, so that actually we're promoting the UK's businesses over time, whilst avoiding things like US law by having this backwards on its own.
Yeah.
Okay. Steve, do you want to jump in?
I will, thank you. And I mean, my first reflection on this is that we're not the United States, we're not China, we're not the EU, we're not in the EU, and so we can't have a pure sovereign model. Thank you. We're always going to consider it a localized model, or at least in the short to medium term, and maybe some kind of hybrid model which I think sovereign AI could make a reality. But I think for us in the UK, that sovereignty really can't be about isolation, to your point, but it has to be about making sure that we've got that control and resilience and capability, particularly in some of the areas that are really important to us. Peter Karl, when he was Secretary of State at DC, of course he's now at Business and Trade, has said that we really as a country want to shape that AI revolution, and rather than waiting for it to impact and shape us, I think that is a really important intent for us as a country. But of course, we're not in a position where we're going to be able to build everything from scratch. And so that localization and adaptation of global models has to be the way that we progress. But I think, to go back to the flywheel, in some of those strategic sectors for us, and I think about things like health, defence, particularly some of our core public services, we've got to have that ability, build that ability over time to be able to deploy those AI systems independently. In more of what I would think of as a hybrid sovereignty stance. So we're supporting a mixed approach in government. So we're building some of the core capabilities at home with our partners, but we're also open to continue global collaboration, innovation, and so forth.
So I feel like I have to play devil's advocate at this point, because we should have had another panelist who had a slightly different view, and we don't have it today. There is another approach being taken in certain jurisdictions, including the EU, which they would probably not use the term isolationist, but I would. And what they're looking at is building from the ground up in country. Obviously, to do that, they have to use open technologies, because they simply don't have the technology. And one of the flaws in that for me, which is why I've never supported it, is that when you go to that open source software, that open AI, what you find is that it's been made from global collaboration. So there is really no such thing, even in the US, as technology that is purely from that country. Technology has evolved as a sort of global ecosystem. But I will open up to questions in about 8-9 minutes. And when I do, if anybody wants to, support that perspective or come in from that perspective, we're happy to talk about it. Absolutely.
Can I jump in? So I've got a really good practical example about AI development. So you talk to people in government, they talk about what does this mean for Mrs. Jones at the kitchen table. This is a very Mrs. Jones thing, because it's about a Welsh language model that has been trained on Isambard AI, which is the UK's fastest supercomputer, which contains about 5,500 video superchips. And so it's a collaboration between UCL and Bangor University to train a Welsh language model, and also to kind of focus on other UK languages like Cornish and Nscale. To actually make those, to make AI services in public sector, usable for Welsh speakers. And this required kind of collaboration between, so it was actually trained on UK soil, on a UK supercomputer, based on an open source model that NVIDIA put out called Nemotron, which is a version of Meta's open source model Llama. And then it's kind of post-trained on Welsh data to make this kind of world-first Welsh model. So, as you said, I completely agree, Amanda. It's about bringing in the kind of open source kind of models, global collaboration and technology, but very specifically focused on something very discrete for the UK and for Wales. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for a UK supercomputer. There's not a commercial interest in that. So that's what I think you can get from Sovereign AI. And actually then it's going to be hosted on Nscale as well. So again, you kind of can see these pieces together that create something very, hopefully something very real for people that makes a difference in their lives.
And I'll get lynched by the open source community if I don't jump in and say Llama's not technically open source, but OpenUK did sponsor and back Llama's launch because we view that openness as critical. And I think exactly what you're talking about there, Max, that ability to iterate and develop on others' technology is really at the heart. And what we're talking about there is access to the technology and the ability to use and reuse that technology. Around the supply chain, how do we see this all fitting into the supply chain? Is that something that anybody wants to comment on?
Yeah, I can. I mean, just before that, if I can determine the difference between open source software and stack, which absolutely is by its nature global, and then we're talking about sovereignty from the physical facility on it, and I think that's where we should focus. Internet cables being cut, and avoid things such as that. That's important. From for the supply chain element, it used to be joining the queue to get chips from NVIDIA and AMD and Intel, etc. The real element of the supply chain now is certainly the UK energy. So if you ever hear the CEO of NVIDIA speak, he'll say there's this direct correlation between energy and intelligence. And it's absolutely right. In order to create these AI gigafactories, as they're called, or data centers that serve AI infrastructure, then because of the nature of the infrastructure itself, it needs a lot of power. To the extent where data centers are now being commissioned in the UK, Europe, globally, that are 10x, even 50x the size that they were on traditional computing. And therefore, for the UK, the AI GZ, the Artificial Intelligent Growth Zone initiative is really, really, I think, solid. We went from one extreme to say who has some power in the UK, and I think there's 213 responses, to the extent of who's got 500 megawatts and 100 acres of land, which then sort of reduced it dramatically, and everything in between. But it gave the UK a real feel for what was out there, what was available, what the appetite was to regenerate brownfield sites from old steelworks or manufacturing plants or battery plants, etc. The ability to, across the UK, rejuvenate areas that were just typically lay dormant. The reason why that's interesting because these sites already have power, they've already got network capability, they just now need to be redeveloped to house AI. The other thing which I think is key is the 6 gigawatts, more than 6 gigawatts of renewable offshore energy in the UK. But at the moment, the national grid is not in a position to be able to absorb it. And therefore, through the AI GZs, the AI growth zones, wouldn't it be great if these were a catalyst, the data centers were a catalyst, to repatronise some of the work with transformers, battery powers to level out the stream of renewable and get it into the national grid. So it just doesn't benefit the data centers, it benefits the citizens of the UK. That's why.
I think in what you're saying there, there's a lot to unpack. When we talk infrastructure, there's that hardware infrastructure, which is a physicality that we need to ensure is there for the UK, whether that's the pipe that isn't cut, the submarine cables, through to the energy provision. But I also think what you just raised about supply chain and rural areas and seeing the UK's tech landscape broaden out is really critical. We often talk about a submarine under the digital economy, and we talk about the open source developers. So a lot of them are home working individuals who contribute to global tech. When we look at the sort of heat map of that, we actually go all the way, you're talking of your Welsh example, from Barry Island to Shetland, when you look at the top 100 contributors. And I think what we're seeing from the work that you're doing is the potential really to open up a UK-wide tech sector that isn't just in the southeast or in the main hubs. Steve, do you want to come in?
And I think that's a really important point, because there is what is there is to understand with regional partners and the extent to which we have money development for decades in the UK. I think that this is a potential opportunity for us to pull that right to address some of those questions. And in particularly is a concern for areas like mine in Red Wall Seeds, former industrialised communities, and it centres around, of course, questions about the UK economy, but also economic efficiency. We have for 30 years or more been hot housing certain parts, certain geographies in the UK, had all that period of uneven development. And I think this gives us that opportunity to really strongly address that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, Karl, you've been in the tech sector just about as long as me. I think you did something else first. And when you look back at the dot-com boom, what you saw was a lot of technology coming to market that didn't actually scale. So I was seeing things like tablets, digital fridges around 2000, and it didn't scale because we didn't have that infrastructure and that connectivity across the UK. So I guess what you're flagging there really is the criticality that infrastructure is rolled out UK-wide. And I think we're seeing that with some of the supercomputer rollout, Edinburgh, Bangor, some of the other cities in the UK benefiting.
And out into the regions that have really suffered from that.
I think that's the important thing about the growth zones, is that they need to be a kind of an engine of regional growth as well. There's some evidence coming out of ETH Zurich about putting kind of supercomputing clusters with research institutes increases the velocity of the startups you get out of that area specifically. But that isn't something that just happens automatically. It's a combination of technology, kind of politics, and policy to make sure that you kind of keep those companies there. So like there's some great companies around this area who are doing interesting kind of AI work and development, and giving them the kind of infrastructure to help them build new tools and services is a really important way to kind of get that regional growth. It has to be very deliberate. It just doesn't happen. There's a very simple way of just kind of accessing your AI compute in other parts of the world.
And I guess one of the things that also brings is people working not just in UK companies but international companies where you bring salary levels into the infrastructure, but those rural areas have missed in the past. So I'm going to pause the discussion we've got. We're going to come to governance and potential government policy. But before we do that, I think I'd like to come out to the floor and just open up the conversation a bit and see what questions you've got, and then we'll work out how much there is from the audience and when we come back in. So gentlemen there at the back. Can you say who you are, where you're from? Thank you.
James from Cooperatives UK. We're talking about the big amount of foreign investment coming into the UK to build these data centres. So could you just say a little bit more about what the arrangements could be for UK actors to exercise some kind of ownership and control of that infrastructure when it's built? I didn't quite understand that. What you said so far.
I can tell you our business model. So we've been fortunate enough to close our Series B last week to the tune of 1.1 billion. Unfortunately, the investors that are coming in, none of them are from the UK. There's some European, there's some Nordics, and also some tech companies like NVIDIA from the US, and Dell, Nokia from Finland. We've all believed that the UK is in this Goldilocks position, which Jensen says, as long as we have the infrastructure. The way it works is we take that capital and we look for sites in the UK. We also look for sites abroad as well, but in the UK, and then we will secure planning permission, we'll secure energy agreements, and then we'll look for what we call offtake. So we'll look for organisations who want to train their models or tune their models or influence their models on our infrastructure in the UK. And interestingly, the two largest clients we've secured at the moment are OpenAI themselves into the UK, and also Microsoft coming onto a UK software platform, which is an interesting concept. Because we have that assurance that they will stick with us for at least 3 to 5 years, then that allows us to underwrite the ability to spend a lot of money on NVIDIA's equipment, install it accordingly, and then we serve it back to these organisations, which means the overseas investment comes in, we then spend it here, and then we then rent it out to whoever, and that revenue stays in the UK economy accordingly. What we're also trying to do, in early conversation with people like the National Wealth Fund, is to say, wouldn't it be great if we could reserve some capacity, which may be funded by the National Wealth Fund or someone like that, to offer some form of credit or access to AI compute that allows startups, allows research institution startups to actually get access to this, to start to develop their own models and stimulate innovation that way. So they're all ongoing discussions. Max mentioned about the flywheel. There is the UK AI Sovereign Forum as well, which sat at number 10, I think about 6 or 7 weeks ago now. And people like Barclays, BT, Babcock, National Grid themselves, BAE, all put their hands up to say, if there wasn't a UK sovereign alternative, we would definitely jump on board to stimulate it. And straight away that would help as well.
And I think what you is almost an age-old concern in the UK, right? And it's something I see day to day with people I work with around OpenUK who tend to be leaders in open source or in AI, but they choose to live in the UK, choose to stay here. Very few of us are really employed by UK companies. You know, I talk about this submarine competition economy, and it's not just because we're employed by the big techs, it's because we're employed by companies which will take investment in the US. I don't know what you've done, but they often shift to being a Delaware corporation and the US stops owning them. I can give you examples of companies, even a unicorn sitting in London with the head office in London, which the UK doesn't claim because we sort of lose the structure. I know there's a lot of work going into building companies and scaling companies in the UK. But you're not going to wave a magic wand and change that overnight. I mean, that's going to take time for us to get to the situation where it's UK execs at the table.
You know, I don't reflect on that. I think the US economy is 10 times the size of the UK. So, you know, we're not escaping that. But it's clear that raising capital is required for a lot of things that we're trying to do, you know, around, particularly around the talent reform and so forth, to really enable companies not just to start up here, but to have a really good environment for scaling up the business as well. You know, having that sovereign AI capability and that flywheel is hugely advantageous to those companies to be able to scale up here in the UK as well.
If it's of interest, we did a report in July 23 called Show Me the Money out of the UK, and we spoke to a lot of people who had left the UK, gone to the Bay Area, left France, Docker's founder, gone to the Bay Area, and Bay Area investors. And we really looked at the different nexus of what it was that made, you know, the location particularly special. What we're not talking about is the whole US. We're talking about pockets in the US where people come together, where investors are risk tolerant, understand risk, and offer better terms, but they're spread better. So, you know, you need a scale of that in a place to make it work. I think this gentleman had a question. One over there. Do we have any more? See if we get through those three and we'll go back to the
Thank you, Amanda. My name's Matthew Trimming. I've got a portfolio of things I do. One of the things I do is chair an AI solutions company in defence. So we'd love to hear from Hannah a little bit more about the ambition to work with SMEs in that space. You also mentioned health SMEs, for example. And then I suppose, fantastic, you closed your round. I mean, I used to work venture capital in the SaaS space. So, you know, closing rounds is hard, so congratulations. But concerns around UK energy policies, did that come up in your round? Because, I mean, this is, you know, the elephant in the room.
Yeah, I've written it down here, so,
Okay.
yeah.
So, thoughts on that?
You do look remarkably fresh, I have to say, for someone that's just closed the building.
Well,
Maybe a
maybe
spa or
you-
something on the way here.
No.
Maybe you did it all yourself.
Well,
No, I didn't. So, if I take the first part of your question. So, our intent, you know, is to move the discussion further up the stack. So we don't want to be talking about GPUs or infrastructure. We want to be talking about outcomes and how AI solutions could be offered to improve healthcare, drug discovery, threat detection and defence, etc., etc. So we are very much looking at supporting what we call ISVs, independent software vendors, to come onto our platform to be able to commit. I'll give you an example of a company called Darga, UK organisation. They do some really clever stuff on threat detection, and they're currently reliant upon different platforms. Some of the stuff they need to do is at secret and above, and therefore they absolutely need the UK sovereign fund to do that. So that's one example, and we're looking to do that in financial services, etc. So if you've got that in mind, it'd be great to have a chat. On energy prices, then, just for clarity, our main area of data centre build currently is in the Nordics. We have 2 or 3 sites up there, one in a place called Glomfjord, which is in the Arctic Circle. 100% renewable energy coming from the fjords at 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt. Just for clarity, the UK energy cost is around about 22 pence per kilowatt. So we're talking a tenth of the price. So it did come up. It's been conversations, and naturally, when we're attracting now big hyperscalers on board our platform, people like OpenAI, then we want to be able to offer them some cost reduction based upon the margins of the energy that we can achieve, and therefore globally, the Nordics is a very attractive area. So we are sort of hoping to call on the government, although the Energy Council has now met twice, that for where there are AI growth sectors, there is some form of favourability on tariffs for energy that can put the UK in a competitive position to then be able to attract. We've been able to, the North East actually, in Cobalt Park, they're doing some stuff behind the meter which will bring pricing down, battery farms to level renewable into their system, which allows, we don't get 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt, but we get around about 12 pence. And therefore that is manageable, and OpenAI will come on to that.
That energy conversation is going to go on and on and on, as is the data centre one. That's a long-term conversation that the UK is going to have. Does anybody else want to jump in on that question?
I can clearly. I mean, I think it is a tremendously important question in any energy-intensive industry, and on to the discussion that we're having today. It does seem to me that quite frequently it feels like we should be addressing the way that we price electricity. It's very much tied to the price of gas right now. When gas generation cuts in, effectively it's at a very high price and it's setting prices right across the sector. So I do think we need to think about that pricing model, or we need to take a stake in how we generate electricity from gas, so that we have more control over pricing. It's clear that generation through renewables is much less expensive. We're seeing a different pricing mechanism in the Nordics, but we're tied into this approach around gas setting electricity prices. I think we seriously need to think about what the mechanisms can be for breaking out of that and looking at what's the true cost of generation for the energy that's being used. We're quite some way from that right now, but I think it's an important question to look into.
So, about being part of the Sunday conversation here is that you're sort of setting the agenda for where things are going to go for the rest of the week. So I heard it here first. And last year we talked about data centres and energy, and one of the big problems that they had was getting the energy to the data centres. I don't know if that's improved at all in the last year, or whether they're still struggling with that.
I think data centres, builders and people we partner with are always looking to try and find ways to generate their own.
Yeah.
So they call it behind the meter. So I don't think at the moment, to your point, Steve, actually, I mean, data centres are one area, but the government's got a much bigger decision to get energy into the nation for many other things like manufacturing.
And energy, of course, isn't the only component of that supply chain and the infrastructure that we need to get in place to be sure that we have, I suppose, sovereign or the ability to create our services that we need to give our people the best innovations. So I think there was a question over here.
Andrew Brendan, I work for a company called Data, as around whether data stays in country or not. And I think a follow-up on that is you described what I would say, as a private cloud that is built, and then the example of hyperscalers coming into that UK private cloud, how do you think about it the other way around? Can you have a public cloud provided by Azure or AWS and the data being kept in the UK and still define that as a sovereign cloud?
Software stack or the whole infrastructure and where that's being provided from. We did a very quick sort of heat test on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and we put 4 different definitions of sovereignty up. We put something that meant that it was the best innovation and you had access to that innovation. We put something about not including US technology, something about it being made here, and something about data sovereignty as opposed to digital. And the really strange thing, what does this mean to you, is that the response was not quite, but almost evenly split. Right? So we really do not have agreement across the industry when we're talking about what sovereignty is. And I think this panel is really demonstrating to you where the UK is driving that conversation, particularly with the last couple of weeks of announcements. But I'm going to pass. I'm hoping we don't spend all the time talking about the definition of sovereignty, because I think you've got more interesting things to add. But let's pass that over into the panel.
So data sovereignty specifically, I think it's an interesting thing because data doesn't have any physical mass or weight or whatever. You presume it's there. And so for me, data sovereignty is not necessarily, and it's quite controversial, but not necessarily about where you believe physically is. It's who controls the access to it. So I know there are US hyperscalers that offer on-prem, so you can buy their hardware, you can put it on-prem in your own nation or even your own premises. So by default, you think, okay, because I can see that server, it's in my room, then it's absolutely under my control and it's sovereign. The reality is they still control the logs, and they won't allow you physical access to that because they have to protect the cloud, and therefore it needs to run in the way that they want to serve it. And therefore, if they decide for some reason to change your login or you don't have access to it, then even though that server is there with your data that you believe is in your on-premise, you still can't access it. So for me, data sovereignty is about a control plane, not necessarily about physical.
And you mentioned sort of public and private cloud. Microsoft famously used to talk about open source as a cancer, or Steve Ballmer described it as a cancer, and they're now the biggest enterprise contributor to open source. And they talk about the fact that Azure is almost entirely built on open source, as are most hyperscalers public clouds. So for me, it becomes this access point, exactly what Karl's saying, but the need for that access. And I think we have to really consider interoperability and what that access means. Is it just the software? Is it the service layer? How does it go beyond that? And how does the UK ensure that it's got access should there be a bad actor in the ecosystem? But I'm being quite nerdy. Do you want to jump in on any of this?
I think Karl's given a really good answer.
It's certainly from my perspective, the first thing I said, we're never going to be the United States or China, and so we're not going to have any kind of purist approach to sovereignty. We're not going to make chips. We have our own data centers, but we're going to use AI models that are around global collaboration. So we're going to have a localized model of sovereignty in the UK. I think that's the pragmatic approach to take in the short to medium term. And then the work that we're doing with global partners around Flywheel means that we can move from a localized model to more of a hybrid model, where actually we do own and we fully control all of those assets. And that allows us to develop a stronger sovereignty and a more resilient model over time. But actually, it's going to take those global collaborations to get us to a point where we can feel like we have that greater degree of control and a stronger localization and more control over building data models and the AI models and so forth. But that's really, I think, a kind of medium to longer term aspiration in the UK.
I think a more exclusionary approach, understandably, it's perceived as aggressive, and even the term sovereignty in certain environments is just an aggressive word to use. And you see people pulling back from sharing their technology if they think that that aggression is there or it's being made over complicated for them to do that. So I think if we want citizens in the UK to have access to the best innovation, we do have to take that collaborative and pragmatic approach. I'm going to take one more question from the floor and then sort of wrap up with a final question. I think there's somebody over here.
Yeah, Joe Pepper, next one. It sort of follows on a little bit from the last question. Obviously, we're talking obviously about using technology to effectively democratise and give access to multiple different players in the market, which is great. What we haven't really touched on is cyber resilience, and obviously when we're talking about open source, I think there is a sort of concern potentially sometimes that actually you get into that space where actually I've seen it sort of firsthand. It makes the software more open also to attacks from hostile actors. And I don't know if there's a sort of view that there's something that's happening at the moment that makes that less likely going forward.
I would debate whether it makes it more likely to have those attacks. I think the whole security piece is a software issue. There's just a gentleman behind you that wants to jump in, I think, on what you just said. And just grab that quickly and then come back to the panel.
No, well, we've been hearing the open source is less safe thing for decades. It's not really true. But you talked about UK citizens having access to these resources, and you're doing amazing work. But there's a huge gap in public perception of AI from the elites. We're making money, we're doing amazing things with it. It's the future debate. The public perceptions of AI, which are very negative. The government's own tracker in the UK, loads and loads of scary words people associate with AI. Pew data in America last week that was terrifying, frankly, if you want any democratic support for AI. And I do wonder, this is a question for Steve up in a red ball suit really, whether you're concerned that the sort of grievance-based parties, like Reform, might at some point come after AI and say, this is an elite tool being used to do us out of our jobs. Let's oppose that. So my name's William Perry.
I think it's a real risk because when I talk to my constituents, I see a group of them who are generally pessimistic about the world, have a high degree of distrust in government and technology, and so there is a really important piece of work. And you can see the debate that's already underway on digital ID really mirrors the concerns that group of voters have more generally around tech and AI, that they are very, very distrustful. And there is a real piece of work that government needs to do to really ensure that we're talking about what the benefits are to voters and constituencies like mine and what they get out of it. But it's across the piece that voters are pessimistic. They don't think on the whole that things have got better over the last, particularly in that period since 2008, since the financial crash. And for many of them, they're absolutely right. Their lives didn't get better, and government needs to deliver for those voters. And we need, over a period of time, to build that trust and a little more optimism that actually some of these tools can improve their lives as well. But there's a really broad conversation there with certain parts of the electorate, absolutely.
Thank you, Steve. I think that it was a really comprehensive response. Does anybody else in the panel want to jump in quickly?
Yeah.
We're running out of time.
No, I think it's a really good question. Obviously, it's about a lot of that's about public service design as well, and using AI in a responsible, effective way. So I'm kind of really hopeful that once you kind of properly get good service design into kind of GP receptionists' hands and make that kind of 8 a.m. process of booking a GP appointment more efficient, are those little ways are the ways that kind of start to unlock the public trust that you need. And on a kind of optimistic level, like having done a lot of polling in the past at TBI on trust in technology, what you said is entirely right. There's some interesting polling I've seen recently that says, what are people optimistic about Britain or proud about Britain for? And science research, technology companies and technology growth is kind of definitely trending upwards there. So I think there's a kind of like a kernel of a positive message about what the country can deliver. It won't apply to everybody in the country, but I think there is a potential here that people distrust like technology, but they understand that it is an engine of kind of change and growth that could benefit them, and that's the real difficult political thing to political need to thread.
I know that the research in this space shows that the UK is actually the leading adopter of AI in the public sector at the moment, when we look across Europe. So I think there should be more and more positive stories coming out of that in the next few months and years. Can I just come back to all of you on the panel just to wrap up the session? I'm sort of conscious of time now. Final thoughts on the conversation we've had today and on what government could do or can do or is doing to take this forward and ensure our sovereignty?
So yeah, I'll end on that. I think we should be optimistic. I think Jensen Wang was right. We are in a gold position. We've got a fantastic heritage. We've got the best brains, the best universities in the world here, and we just need to give them the access to the tools that can help them flourish and ideally boost the economy as well. So the government can help us. Energy prices is one, planning permission, others, but also I think to William's point, actually to help educate the general public as a whole that if you demonise AI, then you're going to resist adoption. But if you focus on the outcomes of how AI can benefit the lives of citizens, for me that's something.
Max, I'm being told to be quick.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Karl. Speed of delivery is really important in this, supporting UK companies and having an ambition to kind of keep UK companies building better services and applications for UK citizens. I think we should be optimistic because of Nscale and what it's achieved, like the biggest Series B in Europe ever, I think. So it's kind of, so lots of reasons to be optimistic, but the government just needs to kind of deliver their opportunities action plan at pace.
And delivering that plan, Steve, any final thoughts from you?
Well, I think why that delivery is important for my constituents. It's really very quickly in two ways. People who have been failed by deindustrialisation have seen their gross value added and wages fall over decades. They've seen no improvement in their living standards since 2008. I think that what we've talked about today has the capacity to improve that situation right across the regions. And I think from that perspective, I think thinking about how do we build digital skills into our schools to make it like English and maths and reading and arithmetic. I think digital skills really have to be built into our education system right from the beginning. I think it is really important for people in constituencies like mine to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that we talked about.
Thank you very much, panel. I'd like to ask the audience to join with me in thanking the panel for. We'll be back here tomorrow at 5 p.m. talking about business